G'day, mate. 40 here. So, one thing I found interesting in the French elections last weekend is how other parties of the left and centre were able to get together, work out a deal so that they would run the candidate who was most likely to win against the quote-unquote far-right party. And so that level of cooperation, right, requires essentially a pro-social personality, because if you had elements of America's dissident right trying to get together and work out some kind of power sharing arrangement, it wouldn't go too well. So what's called the far right and the far left in France seems to be much more pro-social, in that they're able to work out political deals amongst themselves to further their own interests in ways that the far right and the far left in the United States appear less capable. And that's because people in Europe generally have more friends and tighter relations with family. They don't move around as much as Americans. They're not nearly as atomized. They're connected to particular soil and to particular kin relations and communal relations in a way that most Americans are not. And so they're able to reach deals. So I've been thinking a lot about the Joe Biden story, not because I have any particular interest in Joe Biden, with regard to how power operates and with regard to how the news media operates and covering up Joe Biden's dramatic cognitive decline, and how they excoriated conservatives for noting for the past 6 years Joe Biden was obviously senile. Because my primary interest is in structure, not personalities. Right? It's structure that tends to run the world, not personalities. Right? Joe Biden has a staff, and the staff makes most decisions. And having a feeble president, Stephen Walt notes in a new column for Foreign Policy, that having a feeble, frail president is not a national security issue, except in two areas. Right? There are two areas where having a frail president is a national security issue. One is if there's an imminent threat, aka the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right, the use of nuclear weapons is something only the President of the United States can do. So if you have a frail President of the United States and you've got this dramatic threat, then you're definitely playing at a disadvantage. There are some things only the President of the United States can do. And then the second area where you're playing at a significant disadvantage is if you need to assemble a coalition of other countries. And so President H.W. Bush was able to do that with regard to the first Gulf War in 1991. He was able to assemble an international coalition to push Iraq out of Kuwait. Right? Joe Biden, in his frail state, would have a much more difficult time doing that. Now, you could say, oh, he helped assemble a coalition to defend Ukraine. Well, Ukraine's in Europe. Europeans have stepped up, and this is a coalition completely removed from American interests, actually working against American interests. So this coalition has just been a disaster for America and for Ukraine and for Europe. And the coalition wasn't asked to assemble arms and do anything like the coalition that H.W. Bush assembled to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. So if we have a major national security crisis, or if we have to assemble international coalition to go to war, right, you'd need a strong president of the United States. Otherwise, the structures in place, right, American strength does not depend upon the mental acuity, the physical strength, the charm of the President of the United States, right? American strength primarily depends upon its military might and its economic might. And those don't seem terribly affected by Joe Biden's frailty. Then I was just listening to the podcast Goodfellows out of the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, my God, has Neil Ferguson declined as an intellectual? So you see him all over YouTube. If you have any right-leaning inclinations, right, you're always being promoted this Neil Ferguson video and that Neil Ferguson video. So much of what he has to say is ridiculous. That he used to do strong academic work, but now that he's become an influencer, right, it's ludicrous, many of the attention-grabbing pronouncements that he makes. So he's got a new paper out, published in Barry Weiss's Free Press, comparing the current state of the United States to the last days of the Soviet Union, which is just a completely ludicrous comparison. Right? The Soviet Union was a totalitarian communist regime where you didn't get to elect your leaders, where there was no independent judiciary, where the economy was falling apart. Right? The United States economy is by far the strongest in the world. US is on the cutting edge of creating new technology. The future is largely created in the United States. So it was attention grabbing, and Neil Ferguson seems to do so much just to grab attention. And as with his colleague in the San Francisco Bay Area, John Yoo, who's an attorney who served in the Bush administration, wrote memos defending extreme interrogation that some people called torture. Right? He's crossed the John Yoo line, where many, many years ago he ceased to be a serious scholar and now makes pronouncements completely outside of topics that he knows anything about. And one should be incredibly humble and reluctant to comment on things that you know nothing about, because it's an addiction, right? Once you get into the habit of just surfing the discourse, making pronouncements willy-nilly, it's a hard habit to break. And so when you have something serious to contribute, people will be less likely to take you seriously, because we're all looking to dismiss people, right? When we first get to know people, right, our default is no. And that's why you shouldn't reveal particularly vulnerable parts about yourself when you're just meeting people, because our default is just to say no. Then for people who are looking for serious thinkers, right, once you start making attention-grabbing and empty pronouncements like Neil Ferguson is so fond of doing, or John Yoo, then serious people will just dismiss you. So a consensus is developed with regard to Joe Biden's speech last night. Speech and then press conference, it was solid, but it's not going to do anything to weaken the resistance movement. And so more and more Democrats are calling on him to step down. Donations have frozen to the Democratic Party. And though there are new polls out showing Joe Biden close to even in the race with Donald Trump, the average of the polls shows him behind in all the battleground states. So I don't think the press conference last night will change the direction for Joe Biden. It's inevitable that he's going to be pushed out. I look forward to an open convention for the Democrats in about 2 months. Should be exciting.